All right, so good morning, good afternoon. Welcome back from the break. For those of you who had the chance to get coffee, while we get everybody on stage and all set. So we're now jumping into the first panel discussion of our two half-day webinars. The first session here is dedicated to the geoeconomics and the balance of power in East Asia. As Françoise Nicolas mentioned in the beginning, in her introductory remarks, we seem to have come to an end of an era of hyperglobalization. We've seen the return of geopolitics, and now we're talking about what we see as the emergence of a new geoeconomic world order. And so the big question is really, what comes next? Are we looking at some sort of recalibration of globalization, some sort of globalization 2.0? Or are we looking at a much more decoupled world, moving into some sort of Cold War 2.0 scenario, which some alarmists have pointed to. And so to sort of get into these issues here today, we'll do this sort of in three parts. First, we're going to talk about what this new geoeconomic world order is. Secondly, we'll look at some of the tools of economic statecraft that are being used in this sort of new era of geoeconomics. And finally, we'll talk about the geopolitics of connectivity and the various connectivity projects that are underway in East Asia, how those work together, how those compete, and how states in the region are adapting to these various factors. And so with us today, we have a great panel of experts to talk. To begin with, we have Dr. Anthea Roberts, who is a professor of the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, where among many other things that she does, and of particular relevance to us today, she chairs the ANU Working Group on Geoeconomics and leads the Navigating the Emerging Geoeconomic Order project at ANU. She is the author of numerous books and articles that have won all sorts of prizes that I won't necessarily go through all of them, but I'm particularly eager to get my copy of the latest book that she has written called Six Faces of Globalization: Who Wins, Who Loses, and Why It Matters, that she has co-written with Nicholas Lamp and is published at Harvard University Press. I was hoping to have my copy of that book before we started today, but somehow it's stuck in the mail. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to look through it, but I'm looking forward to some of your insights that you've brought out there. Next in the line is Dr. Shui Gong, who is an assistant professor in the China program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, where she specializes in international political economy, China's economic diplomacy, regionalism, and governance. And in particular, she co-edited a book entitled Securing the Belt and Road Initiative, Risk Assessment, Private Security, and Special Insurances Along the New Wave of Chinese Outbound Investment. She has done extensive work on questions of China's economic statecraft, corporate social responsibility, and the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia. So we'll be very happy to hear from you. And also, last but not least, Dr. Chung Chui Kwik, who is Associate Professor of and head of the Center for Asian Studies at the National University of Malaysia's Institute for Malaysian and International Studies, and is concurrently a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute. And we were very lucky to have Dr. Kwik with us back in 2018 when we were still doing physical conferences, and hopefully we'll be able to get you all back here again soon for one of those. And at that time, Dr. Kwik, you were working on a book that is now published, which is entitled Rivers of Iron, Railroads, and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia, that you co-authored with David Lampton and Selina Ho. So at the time, we talked about some of your initial reflections on that, and so we're very eager to get into what your conclusions were and how you've been able to develop your analysis since then. So thank you for all three of you for joining us, and so we're looking forward to this discussion. We'll have a little over an hour, about an hour and 10 minutes or so, get into this. And so first, maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Roberts. Why don't you kick us off and give us your assessment of what you see as this new era of geoeconomics.
Right. So I think you're going to be sharing my PowerPoint screen.
Indeed.
And let's just get that to come up.
Yeah. My apologies. I actually closed the application. I will open it back up for you. Just one moment.
Right.
There you go. The floor is yours.
Thanks. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I think one of the reasons that you invited me was I'd done a sort of an early blog series on this idea of the emerging geoeconomic world order. And it was something at the time when I wrote it, a lot of people were dubious that this was happening or didn't like that this was happening. And so mine was not an argument in favor of it, but it was an argument that this was happening and we needed to understand it. And so what I wanted to do in my sort of opening remarks here is, if you go to the next slide, really just introduce two basic ideas. So the first one is to give a bit of a description as to what I see as the core characteristics of this shifting economic orders and why I think it's happening. But the second is to go to John's question, to focus a little bit on technology competition, because I think that's where we're going to see this happen most acutely. So if we start with the shifting economic orders, I think that, and we've already had this come out in the panels this morning, we're seeing a real shift between what the last panel would call the era of hyperglobalization and what we're now calling this new geoeconomic era. So if we go to the next slide, I would say that the characteristics of this period of what some people call hyperglobalization, what I've called here the neoliberal economic order, is not that security was absent from it, but that security kind of existed on the margins of the system. So it tended to be a justification for why you had trade and investment treaties, and it tended to be an exception to those trade and investment treaties, but it was very much the exception and not the rule. Instead, what we saw was a very strong kind of economic mindset predominant that was sort of focused on win-win, focused on absolute economic gains, and really saw economic interdependence as something that drove economic efficiency and as a source of opportunity. And this was also a period where we didn't just see hyper-globalization, but we also saw highly legalized dispute resolution through things like the WTO and the investment treaties. Now, if you want to sort of see what I think has shifted and what we have now in this geoeconomic world order, I think that we would find, on the next slide, John, a very different constellation of characteristics. So the first thing is, instead of focusing primarily on absolute gains and win-win, it's much more of a focus on relative gains and who wins and who loses and by how much. The second is that instead of seeing peace as a sort of a product, so if you have trade and investment, then you're more likely to have peace. This era starts to think that maybe peace is actually a precondition for trade. So if you don't have security relations and you don't have trust, maybe you won't have trade between certain blocks. This is an era that starts to focus very much on interdependence, not as a source of opportunity because of efficiency gains, but as a source of vulnerability and threat. And finally, what we're really starting to see now is, instead of the very legalized dispute resolution, we're starting to see very frequent and wide use of national security exceptions, to the point that people think that the exception swallows the rule. So if you were to ask kind of why it is, to go to the next slide, we are seeing this shift in this order, I think that the three things that really stand out that have caused this are, first of all, the closing gap in power between China and the United States, with China having come up on the United States in many domains: economic, technological, military. The second is that we're seeing a convergence for the first time of economic and security competitors. If we go back to the Cold War, we saw that the US had a security competitor in the USSR, and during that time also an economic competitor in Japan, whereas now we're seeing them have to deal with one and the same with China, an economic and security competitor. But we're seeing very, very different behavior going on here, because it's happening in a period of deep economic integration, which is extremely unlike the Cold War. Now, one thing I should say about this is that this is a shift that is happening obviously not just in US and some Western countries thinking, but also in Chinese thinking. So if you look at the next slide, for example, on Gevitz, and when he talks about elite Chinese views, he says, if you understand economic interdependence through elite Chinese views, there's always been a difference of opinion on whether they're good or they're bad. And he identifies three basic approaches from elite Chinese views. One is to look at economic interdependence as a very good thing, as a source or an engine of economic development and technological growth. A second is to see it as a source of risk because of dependencies and vulnerabilities on overseas countries and overseas suppliers. And the final one is to see it as a source of leverage because it can create dependencies and vulnerabilities of other states. And what he says is that historically, even though you've had all three camps, historically, number one has been the dominant camp for the last several decades in China. But what we're increasingly seeing now is that 2 and 3 are becoming much more dominant in the Chinese system. And so we're seeing this very much this shift to this geoeconomic mindset in both the US and China, and that's having ripple effects around the world. So that takes me then to the second thing that I wanted to discuss, which is how is this playing out in technology competition? And so I'm going to start the playing out of technology competition with our understanding of technological competition between China and the United States. So the United States has been the technological leader, and China has been the one that is coming up on its technological lead and starting to, in some cases, catch up and in some cases, potentially overtake. Now, if you are the technological laggard that's trying to come up on the US, so if you're China trying to come up on the US, then my colleagues at the ANU working group would say you've got 3 different strategies that China's employing: making, taking, and transacting. So making is trying to make the technology yourself, which is your whole Made in China 2025. Transacting is going out and trying to lawfully buy the technology. And so we saw a huge movement of Chinese companies to doing that in the last decade. And finally, there's taking, and some of that can be lawful taking, downloading from the internet, and some of it can also be unlawful taking, like cyber espionage. And what we said is that as China closes that gap, the US, in response to these 3 strategies, is likely to come up with 3 strategies of its own. The first is shielding, so trying to protect its technological advantage at home, and we see that very much now through CFIUS and through investment screening, where they're no longer allowing Chinese acquisitions into technology firms. We think it also takes the form of stifling, which is it's not just about protecting your technology assets at home, it's also about undermining the competition abroad. And I think that one you can very clearly see in the way that the US is approaching technology companies like Huawei. And finally, and what we're only just starting to see now in the US, is what we would call spurring, which is it's not enough to just protect your existing lead and try to undermine your competition. You also want to fuel your innovation power so that you can be stronger and faster and go further. Now, when we understand the shift that we have seen in the US-China relationship, I actually find it really helpful to look at the following graph. Now, this graph was actually not done about US-China technology competition. This was about whether or not you would have collaboration between a leading technology firm and an up-and-coming technology firm. So very much like US and China, but this was done in the 1990s and firms. And they actually said if you're the leader, which is in this case like the United States, your net payoff, which is the middle line there, is really a combination of 2 things. On the one hand, we know that when you open an exchange and do innovation together, your actual absolute gains in your economic welfare and your technological gains is actually that upward sloping line, which is it goes up. Even if you're the leader, it goes up through collaboration. But at the same stage, what we know in this sort of collaboration is that the laggard tends to close the gap on the leader. And that means that in a sort of positional security sense, you're losing your lead even as you're absolutely gaining. And I think that's exactly what we see happening with the US and China. And so that net payoff between these 2 different things is one that stays positive for a very long time and then turns quite sharply negative. And so when I taught this to some Chinese students, if you go to the next slide, one of them said to me, it's really interesting that I have this graph because in China, they talk about 4 different stages of the technology relationship with the United States. And one of my very clever students actually plotted those 4 different stages onto this graph where things were going up, things were starting to even out. And then we started to see in about 2016 a very sudden downturn. And that's exactly when we started to see this geoeconomic age. So where does the rubber hit the road for others? So we know that we're going to have this technological competition between the US and China. What we don't know is how divided the technological ecosystems are going to be going forward. Are they going to be very bifurcated? Are they going to sort of have some separate spheres? So you have US and China as different suns, but with an overlap between them? Or are you going to be able to sit in the middle? And here I just wanted to bring people's attention to a report by Brookings, which has some really interesting findings in it. So this is a report by Brookings where it asked tech CEOs from around the world what they were expecting in the 10 years ahead. So the first thing that they asked is, do you expect future policy by the US government towards Chinese technology? What do you expect? And 97% of these technology executives expected that the restrictions were going to become more severe in the next 10 years on China. So they expected greater pressures towards bifurcation. If we go to the next question that the Brookings report asked, they asked, what do you see happening going forward? Do you think that we're going to end up with a complete bifurcation, a partial bifurcation? And what we find here is that about 25% of them thought it would be a complete separation. About 42% thought it was going to be a global duopoly, so US and China as major spheres in their own spheres, but really only competing in third markets. Whereas about another 25% thought that the US would be generally dominant, with China being dominant in a few areas. But nonetheless, what we see here is at least 42% and 25% thought some level of bifurcation, either severe or partial. But interestingly, and if we just go to the last slide of the question, which is the question to them was, what will you do and how will you manage any sort of bifurcation? And interestingly here, most of them said, we plan to either stay neutral and try to balance the relationship between the two. So that's at about the 30% mark that you're seeing through here. Or in the 60s, the people in the 60s thought that they would actually be able to play the two sides off to their advantage. And I think this is a particularly interesting set of slides, and it'll be interesting to see what these same tech executives would say in 5 years and 10 years, because certainly when I showed this to some people in some governments, the reaction is not in agreement with this about the ability to be able to play both sides here. And we are not going to see this anywhere more clearly than in East Asia. And so that's why I wanted to open up with this as not just a general technological competition, but one that has particular implications for third states and third companies about how they straddle these potential divides. So I'll pass over at that, John.
Great, thank you very much. That was a fantastic introduction, and I think one thing that I take away from that, I take a lot of things away from that, but one thing that I think would be helpful moving forward is this idea that it's this geopolitical competition between the United States and China, and the many various levels of competition, and the state at which we're at is sort of defining this new geoeconomic era, and it's sort of moving us into this geoeconomic era. So that graph that you showed, particularly with the 4 stages of Chinese development, and that was really quite illustrative. And so I think it's now a good time to shift and look perhaps a bit more specifically at China's case. And I would say we'll go to Shui Gong, but I think she's having a few technical difficulties with her video, so I don't know if she's able to hear us, or if she's able to chime in at this point. But Shui Gong, can you hear us?
Yes, and I noticed that the internet connection is not stable because it's provided by National Stable, and the university is provided should be provided by our university. But now we're proud of our channel. Perhaps I would suggest maybe I need to, kind of perhaps the Wi-Fi. Maybe I need to kind of.
Yep. Yeah. Why don't you try that? And in the meantime, we'll go to Professor Quick perhaps for some for his remarks, and then we'll come back to you to focus more in on this this question of economic statecraft and the various tools that are being used in this question of economic statecraft. But Dr. Quick, let's go to you then. And one thing that Dr. Roberts had mentioned was this question of divided ecosystems. And I think in that poll that she mentioned, there was something, a conversation we were having back in 2018 when you were here, was how states in Southeast Asia in particular look to play within this geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And in many ways, they're their strategy, the way that I remember you explaining at the time, was really to stay neutral and balanced and not necessarily have to choose and to try to play both sides. And so that's why that poll, I thought that Dr. Roberts had come out, that rang a bell with me with what you were saying at the time. So perhaps maybe we'll go to you, Dr. Quick, while Shui Gong gets her connection. We can. We'll try to come back to you in just a moment. We're going to go to Dr. Quick here for his remarks.
That would be great.
Where we'll try to get your connection sorted out. So, Dr. Quick, why don't you go ahead and jump in here?
Thanks very much, John, and a very good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's great to be back to E3 event again, although this time only virtually. I think since my task that was given by John is to provide a Southeast Asian perspective, so I thought I would have 3 points to share that hopefully will complement Professor Roberts' point of view in certain ways surrounding the very theme of this panel on geoeconomics. So I think whenever we talk about the geoeconomics or geopolitics of connectivity in this era, more often than not, we do here come across the word interdependence. And more often than not, we have also noticed that some analysts would use the phrase weaponized interdependence. So I think there clearly are certain merits and also truth to this notion, which we can see how China responded to Australia, to South Korea after TART, to Philippines, so on and so forth. But from Southeast Asia's point of view, we thought that while interdependence is certainly true, it doesn't provide a complete picture as to how smaller countries in Southeast Asia see the dynamics of geoeconomics and also geopolitics in this era. And my 3 points that I'm going to share is about 3 I's. So number 1 is about inducement, and number 2 is about institutional competitions, and number 3, imbalanced strategy. Let me unpack each of them one by one. And the first point that I've just mentioned about inducement is certainly a response to what we in Southeast Asia think the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, for example, has been portrayed as a big power push. And again, I think from how we see it from Southeast Asia, and that's very much based on the fieldwork of the book that John was very kind to mention early on. So my co-authors and I, we spent a few summers going around Southeast Asia. The impressions and also the feedback we have got from elites, some former leaders, is that actually most Southeast Asian countries, especially the political and also policy elites, see China's Belt and Road not just about big power push. More often than not, the reality is smaller states pulls as well. And which is why I think inducement is actually a very relevant and important word to describe China's Belt and Road. And I do think that the competing schemes that are being provided and also put forward by United States, by EU, and also Japan and other countries should also be served as inducement. We have been hearing a lot of criticism about China's Belt and Road, and certainly that's a reflection of the reality. There are many, many problems about China's Belt and Road, but I think Southeast Asia see that and wish there are more than one inducement. There should be a Chinese inducement when it comes to Belt and Road, and other competing powers should also put forward their own inducement as well. And this is because in 21st century, geoeconomics are geopolitics. And the economic statecraft, especially in the form of connectivity, infrastructure and transport connectivity, is not a matter of economics or development. It's a matter of politics. And this is so true for most, if not all, small countries in Southeast Asia, where all ruling elites see development as a matter of fundamental political merits. So because of that, Belt and Road is actually an inducement. China sometimes do not have to push. Smaller countries are the ones who try to pull China in. And this is confirmed by a lot of the fieldwork interview that we have conducted. For example, in Thailand, we talked to former Prime Minister Abhisit, and he was the one who recalled during his time, Thailand was the one who actually talked to China about the high-speed rail. And that was one project that, although did not complete during his time, his successors, Yingluck and also Prayut have continued. And of course, to mix reaction. And the same with the case of Malaysia and Singapore. Again, Malaysia and Singapore are the one who have been taking a lot of initiative to have a connectivity cooperation. Mahathir, despite the fact that he suspended 3 China-related projects, but he was the one, even back in 1990s, before the word connectivity came into the lexicon of IR, he was the one who proposed to have the Singapore-Kunming rail link, China to collaborate with ASEAN countries. And we have been seeing some mixed progress as well. Singapore, even though did not host any China-related projects, but Singapore has taken the initiative also to collaborate with China in the form of Chongqing Connectivity Initiative and many other projects. So I think inducement is a very important word that would help us to understand how Southeast Asian countries actually do not just see big power push, but small countries' push is also very, very important. So small state does have an agency. And by just talking about weaponized interdependence, I think we would be giving too much credits or agency to China. I think the reality on the ground is much more complex, which brings me to my second and also my third point. So my second point is institutional competitions. I think the geopolitics of connectivity indicates that connectivity takes many, many forms. It's not just about physical connectivity, not just about infrastructure connectivity. China's Belt and Road economic statecraft has been taking also institutional forms. We know full well about the AIIB. We know a lot of the BRICS and also other development banks. But in Southeast Asia, there are also some institutional push that have been done by China. And you see that China has been quite strategic in proposing one in mainland Southeast Asia and the other one in maritime Southeast Asia. The one in mainland Southeast Asia is already well discussed and analyzed in the form of Lanchang Mekong cooperation. And then there is a parallel but less discussed, is a slowly emerging version in maritime Southeast Asia in the form of Bianga plus China. But let's highlight this emerging fact in the sense that China clearly is not the only kid in the block, and in this institutional game, many other competing powers has also come up with parallel mechanism. And because of these competing schemes, for example, Japan and South Korea, and of course the US has also some parallel economic statecraft towards Mekong countries. So all these competing mechanisms have determined that smaller states do have some space to maneuver. Although across 10 ASEAN countries, you do see a different degree of success or activism. But let's move on to my third and also my final point. The third I is about the imbalance strategy. An imbalanced strategy primarily on the part of China, but I would say that the other competing powers have also displayed some strategies that are imbalanced, at least in the eyes of smaller countries in Southeast Asia. Imbalance in the sense that we need to understand, well, we say that geoeconomics, geopolitics in 21st century, what we mean is that the competition among the big powers have been very much conducted along twin chessboards of military chessboard and non-military chessboard. And this is might be obvious to some, but if we bear in mind what happened during the Cold War in 20th century, the US-Soviet competition was very much conducted along military chessboard. But what is going on between China and US, and also China and also US allies and partners, is that military chessboard is clearly one important chessboard, but non-military in terms of connectivity development, in terms of supply chain, in terms of health development, so on and so forth, is also a very important chessboard. But we do see imbalance emphasis across all countries and all powers. China, for example, seems to be overestimating the developmental benefits of a second chessboard, economic chessboard, thinking or assuming that the benefits that are given to smaller countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere will somehow offset our security concerns over the first chessboard, meaning the South China Sea, the maritime, the territorial issues. I think this is imbalance. China overestimates its development benefits, but underestimates smaller countries' sensitivity about those core autonomy and security issues on the first chessboard. So US and other powers similarly seems to be also over-investing what they are pretty good at, which is maritime and military. The recent announcement about AUKUS is just another example where US seems to be, of course, showing a lot of positive signs that US is coming back as kind of pivoting to Southeast Asia, if you could use the term. But we have seen more investment and efforts from Washington and allies, primarily on the first chessboard. The second chessboard, we have hearing a lot of announcement. For example, the Build Act 2018, for example, Blue Dot Network, for example, Build Back Better World. But all of these 3 years after the announcement, few years after the announcement, has very much remained as announcement. So I do think that those are imbalanced. US cannot compete, cannot push back China's growing activism in Asia, in Southeast Asia, just by investing primarily on the first chessboard. Second chessboard is equally important in order to have a sustained and also important long-term strategy in Southeast Asia. I will stop here. Sorry for taking longer than I expected. Back to you, John.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. Thank you. I think you talked quick. And Shui Gong, are you, Dr. Gong? I guess you seem to have a much more stable internet connection, so I'm very happy for that because I'm eager to get you involved in this discussion here. So Dr. Quick had talked about sort of the push and the pull factors and the agency and the fact that small states do in fact have agency. I guess maybe I'd like to come back in some ways to this this push factor, and talk a bit about the instruments of geoeconomic power. And so that what I was hoping to hear from you, I guess, is to discuss a little bit about what the instruments of geoeconomic power are as we enter into this new era of geoeconomics, how states are wielding that power. And I know you've done extensive work on what China has done in that sense, and perhaps we can later on get into a discussion about what the U.S. has been doing, how states like Japan are also reacting to this, but perhaps you can take some time and talk to us a little bit about this notion of the instruments of geoeconomic power, how they're being wielded, what goals and strategies there are, so please, why don't you take the next 10 minutes or so, and tell us what you think.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much, John, for inviting me to this conference. And it's my great honor and pleasure to join this panel with two esteemed scholars. And our panel and the discussion previously have already touched many points that are relevant to my presentation. As John just mentioned, I was tasked to focus on sort of like 3 questions with regards to China's role in the geoeconomics and the implications of the balance of power in East Asia. I will try to address all of them within the next 10 minutes. So first thing first, how the Chinese state has been developing or wielding the instruments of geoeconomic power. If we follow what David Baldwin identifies in the economic statecraft literature, generally speaking, there are 2 ways, right? As we all know, economic incentives or inducements and sanctions. So I would like to also characterize China's instruments of geoeconomic power into these 2 categories. So the first one is the carrot of Beijing's arsenal, which is the colossal size of China's domestic market. Its increasing purchasing power of its huge population, and the production hub that Beijing has been using, to tie the interests with Western countries and those MNCs. This has been quite successful for the past few decades, on the basis that the world still believed in free trade, in interdependence, and the casual relationship between interdependence and peace. And the second type of the carrot is China's economic engagement with developing countries through foreign aid, assistance, and state-led investment activities. For instance, the BRI, which Dr. Quick just already touched upon that in terms of how efficient or effective these economic inducements are. And this has been working also relatively well in terms of retaining support from developing countries in foreign policy goals. For instance, with regards to its one-child policy, one China policy, not one child policy, one China policy. But being a victim of Western sanctions for the past decades as well, Beijing nowadays also has shown the inclination to use economic coercion and even sanctions to realize its geostrategic goals. And this kind of coercion usually begins at home market, and the effectiveness so far also remains at home. For the foreign investments now in the Chinese market, they find themselves in a very, very difficult situation or a very different climate, unlike before. It has become increasingly difficult to balance between the lucrative Chinese market and the constant pressure of politicizing issues in the name of national security. And not to mention the bottom-up sentiment of Chinese customers and netizens when things go awry for the foreign companies. For example, the contestations over the one China policy stance in the MNC operations, or the celebrities like, for example, from Taiwan working in the mainland China, they can easily trigger boycotts against these MNC's products and other, entertainment activities. So this is the first kind of, use of economic coercion. But beyond China's border, the second area of the geoeconomic toolkit is the leverage on the bilateral trade relationship from Norway to Australia, Japan, the Philippines, etc., with coercive words and specific trade restrictions and disruptions. We can usually we can make the arguments that China is flexing its muscle, its trade sanction muscle. But here I want to point out that before 2019, Beijing relied merely on administrative measures from implemented by Bureau of Industry, Security, Import and Export Control, which is subordinated to the Ministry of Commerce, to apply ad hoc and very short-lived punishments towards these behaviors that considered violating China's interests. So, but when the time went by, these punishments were generally loosened, and so these punishments can be considered as very, very symbolic. But here comes the changes, or the third approach, which is more recent and more, and more impactful, which is through domestic legislation and mainly targeting on countering the sanctions pressures and protecting its interests in the names of national security and national interests. But so now, what I can find out is Beijing has clearly issued one entity list, 3 laws, national laws, and 2 measures that have legal implications. So starting from 2019 to now, Beijing has relied on these legislations to impose sanctions so far on entities and individuals on the issues such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang. And these measures applied so far include prohibition of entry into Chinese border, prohibition of communication, or freezing of property within the Chinese border. So for instance, from March this year, Beijing imposed different levels of entry, denial, and prohibition of the communication to several members of Political and Security Committee of the EU and a few think tanks, etc., etc. While we understand, Beijing's tit-for-tat sanction is a result of retaliatory sanctions because of provocation by countries like US or the EU on human rights issues or other sovereignty issues, the real question here for this region, for East Asia, especially the middle and small powers, that whether China will proactively resort to these sanctions, even if it is not being really provoked on those sensitive issues like human rights. And the second question here is, what end goals and strategies are being adopted? China's strategic use of economic tools for strategic purpose is definitely not new, and many countries are doing this. But what is consistent in the long term for the Chinese leadership is to protect Chinese national interests and to answer for its legitimacy of the ruling party to domestic audience with regards to these threats from outside. But what has changed now is as what I elaborated just previously, is about the diversification of the tools by either emulating other countries like the EU and Mexico to reduce the consequences of the US long jurisdiction, that's kind of sanctions, and also by emulating the US to mobilize the legal resources. So it's quite phenomenal in a sense. Because it has has a few domestic constraints or domestic restraining factors that can actually hold China from implementing this legislation. But with regards to what's the strategies, it really depends on what issue and who is the target, what sectors the Chinese business actors are involved, and how effective the tools are in the leadership's mind. And at this point, I would argue China's propensity of using economic coercion is very, very constrained, because China needs the world engagement to sustain the domestic economic growth. The most critical legitimate reason or the issue for the ruling party. And that is why we see that two kind of layers of China's economic incentives. Domestically, China has been conducting different kind of reforms, for example, in bond market, in setting up the foreign trade zones, encouraging quality FDIs, and again, to use this huge market and as incentives. It also applied to join the mega trade agreement, which has been ratified. One is the RCEP, and the other is await to be approved or be assessed by the CPTPP existing members. But more importantly, the black swan, COVID-19, actually changes China's plan of dual circulation that places both domestic and overseas market equally. As findings by Ministry of Commerce this year shows that China exports since the breakout of the pandemic is actually increasing, and this made the Chinese policymakers eventually realize, the slowing drivers of their economic model in this circumstance means that they need FDI, and even more quality ones, more than ever. And internationally, I would also like to foresee that BRI will still be put in place, but with a much lower profile and in a much subtle and softer approach, targeting at developing countries for international support. And the connectivity, as Dr. Quick just mentioned, I think will be played through the language of international development cooperation, with the emphasis on conditional governance issues such as poverty reduction, such as capacity building. But these notions are very different from the OECD or the International Finance Corporation's definition. Therefore, at this point, I would like to argue again that China's propensity of using economic coercion is very constrained, but instead it is still interested in using economic inducements for its foreign policy goals. So the last question, what are the implications for the broader regional economic order? First thing first is the unintended consequence in my mind from these geoeconomic tools that could actually escalate reactions and the implementation of these tools. For example, with the US or the UK and EU sanctions on Hong Kong and Xinjiang issues, the Chinese government is believed to react with more punitive measures. And if issues like this continue to be the center of the tensions, which I believe it will, it is expected that the two sides, the West in general and China, will escalate these geoeconomic tools. And I also want to go back to the concept of geoeconomics that Professor Roberts briefly introduced to us, and wanted to highlight the two conflicting ideas here. One is about the major assumption in geoeconomics are that states clearly use or define their geopolitical goals when employing these tools, and the game usually be relative gains and zeros, and even zero sum. But for the neoliberalism, that advocate market economy, free flow of ideas, human resources and goods and technology, they're just so different from what we are seeing now. So therefore, the biggest challenge for the region and the world are how can we have a neoliberal economic order while we are playing the game of geoeconomics. And even more interestingly, we have a liberal state wanting to join the liberal-minded free trade agreement, the CPTPP, while the liberal economies applying the geoeconomics that are contradictory to the notions. So if the geoeconomics continues to take precedence over neoliberalism, I would be very pessimistic that neoliberal capitalism will continue to prevail and thrive in the region. And I'm not very sure how, for example, how these regional mega trade deals will be implemented in this conflicting idea complex. So I shall stop here and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you. And over to you, John.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Shui Gong. It was. I'm very glad we got your connection back, so that you could contribute that for us. That was very very valuable. Thank you very much. This kind of raises a question for me. Some issues that have been coming up, and I'd like you to put this to each of you, and you can tell me what you think. And don't hesitate to jump in and react to anything that anybody else has said so far as well, if you want to get into this. One theme that we keep coming up with year after year as we do this conference, where we sort of try to look at the regional architecture in East Asia. We try to reflect on the regional stability in East Asia, and this question of interdependence, which used to always be thought of as sort of the stabilizer for regional stability. Nobody would want to rock the boat too much because everybody's interdependent on everybody else. But now, what seems to be coming out here is, from each of your presentations, is that this stabilizer of interdependence is being stripped away. And so, Dr. Quick, you talked about the imbalances and the various imbalances between the military and the non-military chessboards, things like this. And now as we strip away this question of interdependence, I guess my question is, what are the risks that we are now moving into a much more conflictual, perhaps armed conflict scenario, and what are the stopgaps to that? So as we move into a more geoeconomic era, are we moving into an era where the risk of armed conflict is not much greater than it has been in the last few decades? Maybe Dr. Quick, you want to jump in on that, or Dr. Roberts, either way.
I think from Professor Roberts' body language, I'm pretty sure she has a lot of points that she would like to share. Yeah. So we can have the same order.
Okay, go ahead. Sure. You're still on mute, Dr. Roberts.
For 2021. I tend to think that we're still going to remain interdependent in many ways, but that there are going to be certain areas where interdependence is going to radically lessen. And I think there are some areas, I think information communication technology for me was always going to be the first one. We were going to see it first through 5G, that was a kind of interdependence that was so structural to society and so invasive in societies and so open to abuse from both sides, that I think that was one where actually having interdependence would have been very unstable going forward. But I think in many other areas like trade, it's not nearly as unstable. We've seen in Australia, for example, very, very strong economic coercion from China, our major trading partner. But one of the things that our group has just been releasing a report on is how incredibly able the Australian exporters were to adapt in various ways as a result. And there were some favourable conditions that happened that year as well. But what we really sort of saw there is it's not just about risks and rewards, it's also about resilience. And it's something like information communication technology there's very little resilience. You do it, you've got it once, and then it's such a big risk to your society and so hard to replace that there's very little resilience. But in many other areas, there's a lot more resilience, and so I think we'll still see a lot of interdependence in some of those other areas, not necessarily on critical goods, but in many other goods. Whether or not this ends up in conflict, look, I really, really hope not. I still think that it's hard to, as rational actors, think that conflict is something that either side will benefit from. So I sort of, from a rational actor perspective, still find it hard to imagine that we go to conflict, whereas I find from a rational actor perspective, having some level of interdependence is not an irrational perspective. But rationality doesn't always win out. And one of the things that we know is when sacred values are touched of individuals, I think also of states, you can have behavior to respond to that sort of violation of sacred values that doesn't always look rational. And so that's what I think we need to be very, very careful of here, that we don't end up in that sort of territory. But I'm still optimistic that it won't end in conflict, and that some level of decoupling, some level, could itself be somewhat stabilizing.
All right, I think that's a good response. I'm perhaps a bit more encouraged. I was getting into this idea that that neoliberalism is dead, and now we're going to end up into a much more unstable situation. But I think that leaves me with a little bit of optimism. So thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. Maybe Dr. Quick, you wanna react as well to that question?
Sure. Thanks, John. And I agree with most of the points presented by Professor Roberts. I guess I would just respond by providing again a smaller state's perspective by three very quick points. I will be try to be very, very brief. Number one is that I think smaller countries in general do have a ambivalent outlook and approach about interdependence. On the one hand, we do welcome interdependence as stabilizing effect in one way or another. But on the other hand, especially when it comes to Southeast Asia, China, meaning asymmetric power relationship, interdependence and dependency are maybe two sides of the same coin. So I think some form of regional interdependence does exist in East Asia region, meaning Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia as a whole. But when it comes to bilateral, individual Southeastern countries relationship, it's a deepening with China, but this deepening relationship might not necessarily be, more often than not, it's not interdependence. It's carrying the risk of dependency, as what Professor Roberts mentioned early on. So that's the first point. Second point is that I think we need to unpack interdependence. Again, there are many forms of interdependence, and what Southeast Asian try to promote the kind of interdependence is a multi-layered interdependence. Economic is one prong, but there are many other prongs as well, institutional and also diplomatic interdependence. And a lot of mechanism that we mentioned about ASEAN-led, ASEAN-based multilateral institutions are aimed to promote the kind of multi-layered interdependence. Economic is a big part, but it's not the only part. And China is a big part again, but China is not clearly the only partner. And ASEAN-led institutions, despite the criticism about all those talk shop and all that, I do think that those roles of promoting multi-layered interdependence over the decades throughout the post-colonial era has been kind of taken for granted. I think ASEAN-led institutions clearly are inadequate, but it's very indispensable. Without ASEAN-led institutions, I do not think the kind of interdependency like RCEP will be possible. And then my third and also my last point is that I agree with you, John, when you say that very frankly and also very, I would say, spot on, acknowledging that we all agree, seeing the dynamics between Australia and China, and also China and many other US allies and partners, is that despite the interdependence, political and diplomatic problems, tensions still occur. But I think this fact does not undermine or dismiss the importance of interdependence in all forms. Without that kind of interdependence, I think we are going to have even greater tension and all that. So interdependence should be perceived as one factor, but we all know that it is not necessarily the primary factor that would ensure the stability or avoid conflict or tension or rivalry. conflict and rivalry and competition will always continue, but more interdependence in multiple directions, not one direction, would still be helpful than less interdependence. So even though we talk about decoupling in some selective way, I think recoupling and continuing interdependence should still be welcomed by smaller countries in the region, especially for those of us who do not want to be entrapped into the growing rivalry. Again, AUKUS is another indicator. We are already in the big hole of geopolitical rivalry. Certain measures and actions might be like digging even a deeper hole. I think I'll stop here.
Excellent, thank you. I'll turn to you, Dr. Gong, as well for the same question about the impact on regional stability and as we strip away certain levels of interdependence, at least. But I also wanted to ask another question based on your presentation. You highlighted the year of 2019 as sort of a shift in China's regulatory regime, I guess, as you would say. And my question, I guess, is why 2019? And you talked also about the retaliatory sanctions, and that China in some way has been rather measured in its actions. But we've also seen that the China's sanctions in some ways have gone above and beyond the level of sanctions that have been applied, particularly when we talk about the sanctions that the EU has leveled on China. And so in some respects, we've seen China that is willing to go to overreact in some ways, and this seems to be happening at the same time as a much more assertive Chinese diplomacy and wolf warrior diplomacy, this sort of thing, and all of this sort of comes into this date of around 2019. And so I'm wondering, in your view, is there something that happened in 2019? Why was there this qualitative jump in terms of the types of measures that China was willing to put in place? Was this due to the trade war? Was it due to something else, a trade war with the United States? So I'd like to hear your feedback on that as well. So you can also jump in on the interdependence question if you'd like, but I'd be eager to hear your views on this as well.
Okay, sure. Okay, sure. Okay, just specifically responding to your question regarding why 2019, and if we go back to 2 years ago, there were lots of coming back and forth, the coalitions between the U.S. and China, and especially when Donald Trump, when he was about to campaign for the elections in in that year, and then we see a much more punitive measures actually implied or applied to the Chinese technology companies, and the sanctions or the entity list expanded in a much larger scale. Not to mention, the trade war escalated into the level that the Chinese leadership, they really faced mounting pressures. So in order to answer that kind of, international, answer the expectations or to pacify the domestic audience, then we somehow see the legal experts and the representatives of the National Congress of the Chinese government. They successfully mobilized this different series of punitive legalization measures in the National Congress. So those are the provocation from the United States and Donald Trump. But later on, which I also discovered, this kind of brewing ideas of having China's own, armed, legalized weapon has been debated for quite some time. It can be dated back to the early 1990s, after the Tiananmen incident, after the Tiananmen students protesting Tiananmen took place. And at that point, Beijing faced, you could say Beijing faced a much much-larger challenges given its economic scale and given its international economic status at that point. But because the Beijing government perceived the sanctions as an imperialistic tool, so there's this kind of narrative and idea hasn't really been put into place. But with, as I mentioned previously, with the provocations and with the domestic demands for retaliation, the Beijing government finally took actions in different stages. Related to the question of interdependence, stabilizer, or the conflicts, I would like to highlight that I think our panelists are quite right in the sense that the interdependence is a very multifaceted concept. It has different layers, and it really matters to which sector you are talking about. But if you look at the China's development course, you find out the Chinese leadership has been was really kind of during the especially during the 1990s to Hu Jintao era, which ended in 2012, they were still fascinated by the neoliberalism at that point because they saw it as benefiting the Chinese economy, benefiting the legitimacy of the party. But somehow you could see they retain certain part of this decoupling. They already started decoupling themselves in terms of how to restrict the information, how to restrict the ideas and somehow the knowledge by having different kind of national industrial policies. So that's one thing I want to highlight. And the second is in terms of the risks, what I can see is more confrontational, ideological based conflicts. I give you example of what I understand as ideational conflicts or tensions. When Xi Jinping took power, we've seen the two forces, the domestic economic circles, they have been debating and fighting back and forth towards which road China should take. Definitely, the fundamental issue is China will not get rid of the Chinese characteristics of socialism or statism. The thing is, to what extent they are going to adopt this the prescription of neoliberalism. But after several rounds of debates, and you find out those much more liberal economists or policymakers, they were actually easily being labeled as foreign agents in the domestic narratives of how to develop the economy. So as Xi is trying to legitimate or justify its indefinite terms in this sixth plenum, I would foresee such kind of ideational debate will continue to dominate how China is going to develop and how China is going to, deal with the rest of the world, especially to the world that is challenging its ideology.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a question that's come into the chat here, and we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. So maybe I'll leave each of you about 3 more minutes to do maybe a last round of remarks, and I'll put a few questions out there onto the floor, and then you can also react to anything that's been said by others at this point. But you'll each have about 3 more minutes before we finish up here. One question that's come in here is with regards to China's market access and being one tool of inducement or sanction, being able to limit China's market access. And the question is about whether or not China is actually overstating or overplaying its hand with regard to market access, particularly in a competition with the United States or with the larger West, in OECD terms, which collectively represents a much larger market than China by itself. So if the collective West, so to speak, is able to act in some degree of unison, then it represents a much larger market than China does. So the question is really about whether or not China is in some way overplaying its hand or overstating the importance of its market. So that question is out there. A second is about Dr. Gong. You in your remarks, you raised a question in my head that I would actually like to pose here to Dr. Roberts about the securitization of trade and the national security arguments, and where that leaves us in terms of this sort of neoliberal world order and in legalistic terms. And I know, Dr. Roberts, you've done a lot of work on legal questions, and particularly where does that leave institutions like the WTO when these national security arguments are becoming increasingly put forward, increasingly prevalent? Does that undermine many of the international rules of trade that we've put in place? And so I guess my underlying question is, in this age of geoeconomics, what is the role for sort of a rules-based economic order, and or do institutions like the WTO or others have a future in this. And then finally, my question is about there's a question about the role for the U.S. and the EU. Dr. Quick, you talked about this sort of multi-layered interdependence and how the U.S. in particular has been overplaying its hand in the military chessboard and not enough in the economic chessboard. What do you think concretely needs to be done? Perhaps on the part of the US, but we have a rather large European audience listening to us, so perhaps you can give some recommendations on what you see the EU could be doing in that sphere. So based on those questions, I'll give you each about 3 minutes. We'll do a last round, and so maybe we'll go in the same order. So Dr. Roberts, why don't you lead us off?
Thank you. So I think the main question you had to me was about the WTO and the institutions and how we deal with that. So I think we're going to see a very different order in the next era going forward. I think that you had a very legalized approach to dispute resolution there. It had gone from the sort of politics to the law and the lawyers. I don't think that's going to be the dominant frame going forward. I think what we are seeing there is a system that is really struggling to work out how to formulate rules when there are big divisions between major powers. And I think in those circumstances, it's very unlikely you're going to have a particularly effective dispute resolution mechanism. So I'm not, that doesn't mean that there isn't any value to it. I mean, Australia, for example, is bringing a case against China at the moment about economic coercion. Many other states are coming on board with that. I think that that has very important symbolic value in the international system, but I doubt that it's going to have a kind of a tangible result that will sort of help to answer these sort of things. And I think that many of the big debates we have going forward are actually ones where we don't yet have proper rules, and that they are on things like data and all the rest of it. So I just don't think we're going to see the same dominance of things like the WTO appellate body in the next era, even if you manage to put people back on them. And I think that's yeah, so I'm much less optimistic about that. I should say I am a lawyer, and so the fact that I am less optimistic about that does not make me particularly popular among my legal crowd. But I think there's an increasing view that that era has shifted a bit.
Excellent, thank you very much, Dr. Quick. Let's move on to you then.
I will have two very quick recommendations. Number one, it's walk the talk. And we understand that the EU as a group has already announced EU-Asia connectivity back in 2018. And then this year, more recently, as part of the Indo-Pacific approach and policy and all that, we have also heard about the Europe's global gateway, in which connectivity building and as providing more alternative to developing countries across the world, different regions, Southeast Asia included. All this should be translated from declaration into actual schemes that smaller countries in various parts of the world could see as something concrete on table. So I do think that walk the talk is very, very important. And the second and a very brief one would be from smaller countries' point of view again. I think some ambiguity is actually a necessity. Some ambiguity in the sense that smaller countries would want to avoid the polarization. As the US-China rivalry goes up, we do become more worried about arrangement and actions that seems to be pushing smaller countries to move to one side against the other. And I think ASEAN countries in general would be very, very uncomfortable. And we do think that some ambiguity where we can kind of partner with different powers on the selected sectors should be allowed rather than being pushed to choose one over the other. So inclusivity and neutrality certainly should be emphasized when we talk about Indo-Pacific being free and open. Free and open, everybody wants it, but smaller countries want more than just free and open. We do want also inclusivity and also neutrality. I will stop here.
Great, thank you, Dr. Quick. So Dr. Gong, why don't you give us your the final remarks here, and then we'll close up the session.
Okay, sure. Before I answer that question with regards to the overstatement of China's market power. I want to like to highlight, in economics, the business actors, they follow the market signals and they follow the efficiency. So the Chinese market for the past decades has proved itself that it through the evidence from the World Bank data that has been already been a production hub, very much a phenomenal advantage that the Beijing government has been enjoying in terms of production of steel, power assembly, etc., etc. But so far, for the business actors, they see the benefits of investing there. Of course, with the changing climate over there, they are starting to think about moving their productions outside of China. But this kind of alternative markets, they're still developing, and some surveys in this region have suggested that, for those relocation or reshoring of these production lines are actually largely concentrated on the low end, production lines. But what remains China, or what is pouring to China in terms of those FDI, they are actually in the much higher end value chains. So, but with all what we've been discussed for the past 1 hour, but we can see that China has already gradually, realized that, at least the leadership realized that it is gradually losing this kind of advantage if it keeps the restrictions or interference in the market, although they are still doing this. So that's why they send the signals that we want to join the CPTPP, and we want to show the world that we would like to conduct the reforms that are conducive to the investment climate. To what extent that kind of pledge of commitment really works, like what they did during the admission to the WTO, that remains to be tested. But at this stage, I think this current leverage of market access is already existing, and it's because of this unique Chinese system that the Chinese state can mobilize the resources and can mobilize the ideas of using market to serve its foreign policy goals, which other countries, especially those democratic countries, that are unable to enjoy. I will stop here.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Thanks to all three of you for your insights and for your comments. This is just the first round of discussions. We'll have more tomorrow. For those of you who wish to chime in, we'll be discussing regional trade architecture and also regional value chains and global value chains. So we'll get much more into the details of these issues as we go. But thank you to all three of you for sort of setting the scene so we can continue our discussions tomorrow. And I encourage the public to please go and read many of the great works that all three of our presenters have been producing, and which is the reason why we've chosen them all to be here today. And thank you very much. Thanks for sticking with us, and I'll see you again tomorrow, I hope. Thank you.